Hey guys, welcome back. It's been a while since we've done a tier list. I figured it was time to do another one. One of our most viewed videos is actually our Voltron tier list video. And so if you've seen that video, thanks for supporting. And if you haven't seen it, you can go check it out. But the video got a lot of people angry. I made the disclaimer that it was a bunch of what was popular according to EDHREC, as well as a couple of my favorites sprinkled in there. And then when people were like, oh, why is so-and-so not in there? Well, gee, I wonder if I covered that in the disclaimer. A lot of people were commenting really good Voltron commanders. It's just between my favorites or where they were on EDHREC, they just didn't make it in that video. But there were a lot of good recommendations left in the comments, so I figured it was worth revisiting this. So today we are looking at another 13 commanders for the Voltron theme. We're just going to go ahead and go in alphabetical order. First up, we're going to be talking about Auntie Blyte, Bad Influence. For 2 in a red, she's a 2/2 Devil Advisor with flying. And whenever a source you control deals damage to you, put that many +1/+1 counters on Auntie Blyte, and you can pay 1 in a red, tap her, and remove X11 counters from her, and it deals X damage to any target. This is pretty interesting because I think the removing the counters thing is actually pretty good and useful. So I don't know how big Auntie Blyte's going to be at any given point, because I think removing those counters is a viable option for dealing with something problematic on the board or knocking someone out if their life total gets low enough. Having stuff that cares about +1/+1 counters in red is cool. This would be really good to pair with the card All Will Be One. And it's also a good like stuffy doll commander, I think. Like you just play these cards that like when it's dealt damage, do a thing or redistribute damage, and then you just play the damage-based board wipes, or you're doing like, the red removal, like lightning bolts and stuff like that. And one of the main criterias I have for Voltron commanders is that they're low mana and have some kind of evasion, and Auntie Blyte does check both of those boxes, only 3 mana and having flying. I think flying as evasion is probably not as good as it used to be, but I do find that a lot of the times in my commander games, there usually is someone on board that you can get through with flying still. So overall, I actually really like Auntie Blyte because of, all those couple things, hitting some of my criteria for a good Voltron commander, as well as having some creative opportunities being in mono red. So I'm actually going to probably put her in S tier. I really like her, and I have considered building her a couple times as well. I guess I should clarify what my tier list system is, and I don't have like a set rule. It's a little bit of a spontaneous thing, but S is like I really like it. I could see myself building it. A is somewhere of like it's really good, but I don't know if I'd build it, but I'd be happy to see someone else play it. B is just mid, nothing against it, it's okay. C is probably not that good as a card overall. Maybe as a commander or in the 99 of another deck, it probably doesn't have that many homes, or it's just been completely outweighed in more recent years. D tier being just don't play the card unless you're trying to give yourself a hard time. All right, next we have Geist of St. Traft. This is for 1 white/blue, 2/2 spirit cleric with hexproof, and whenever it attacks, put a 4/4 angel creature token with flying onto the battlefield tapped and attacking. Exile that token at the end of combat. I know this is an oldie and a goodie to a lot of people, but I think this is one of those commanders that's kind of been outclassed in more recent years. So I will say that hexproof or indestructible or both, those are kind of like a couple of the more important things that I think Voltron commanders are going to need. Because I actually do think that as a whole, the archetype isn't as strong as it used to be. So you want to make sure that your commander is going to be able to stick around. But especially because those angel tokens are just going to go away, it's kind of a bummer. Now, you do have ways to just end the turn, and that would let you keep the tokens, or you are in blue, so you can take multiple turns with extra turn spells and whatnot to get more of these tokens. And these 4/4 flyers, like I said, flying's pretty good. You're usually going to be able to get in for some damage on some player. So even though it's, the main theme of Voltron is get them out with commander damage, these 4/4 flyers, that is going to add up over time. But overall, I think Geist of St. Traft has just been outclassed. I think he's still pretty good, but we're going to have to just put him in B. It's perfectly meh. Next up, we have Grimold the Dread-Sower for 1 black and a green. It's a 3/3 Troll Shaman with Trample. And at the beginning of your end step, each player creates a 1/1 green to plant creature token. Whenever a creature token dies, put a +1/+1 counter on him. I have run Grimold in decks before just for value, but I think the same decks that you would do that in is the same premise of why he would be a good Voltron commander. That being, you're going to like play Edict effects, sacrifice effects. You're giving your opponents tokens and then forcing them to sacrifice them, and then Grimold's going to get huge. I actually like Trample a lot on Voltron commanders because, you know, like I said, the main way to kill someone in Voltron is commander damage, and so even if they chump block it with one of those 1/1s you're giving them, you're still going to get some damage in. I don't know what the power scale of this really would be, but I like the direction. I think it's interesting. I think the problem is that there are just so many good creatures in Commander that I think your opponents a lot of the time are just going to have other options to sacrifice so that they don't have to sacrifice specifically tokens. Now, obviously, you're going to wreck the token player because if they have to sacrifice anything, they're going to probably be sacrificing tokens. So that's pretty good, but that's, you know, a certain matchup that, you know, how often do you see that? So I think for now, we're just going to have to put him in the top of B. I think I like him more than Geist of St. Traft. Depending on how I'm feeling with this list later on, I might move him up to like bottom of A, somewhere in that territory. Bottom of A, top of B. I think it creates a fun, unique play pattern for Voltron, but at the same time, I'm not convinced it's that good. Okay, next up we have Kemba Kha Regent. I think Kemba was one that was like recommended to me in the comments, and I actually don't know for sure which Kemba they were talking about because there are a couple Kembas that could have been on this list. Maybe I could have added both of them onto the list, but I decided to go with the classic Kemba. 1 white. It's a 2/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a 2/2 white cat creature token onto the battlefield for each equipment attached to Kemba. Now, this is an effect I do like on Voltron commanders. I think a lot of the higher ranking ones in the original Voltron tier list I was liking ones that had other ways of making tokens. Now, Geist of St. Traft is not in the same ballpark, I think, because you're going to lose those tokens more likely, but having other ways to protect yourself. If you have, you know, just your one Voltron commander that you're trying to beef up, that's leaving yourself to blow out, which is the main reason I don't think Voltron's really that good in Commander, especially nowadays with removal and board wipes being so prevalent and efficient. So having commanders that can fill up the board in other ways as a backup plan, I think are really good. Now, yeah, they're just a bunch of 2/2s with no effects, but I mean, that's better than nothing. That's, you know, if you get enough of them, you can be going wide enough to get around your opponent's creatures, or they're good blocks. I think Kemba is on the weaker side because it's at the beginning of your upkeep, so you have to, you know, drop Kemba, get some equipments on her, wait till it comes back to your turn again before you get any of those tokens. So, you know, it would obviously be better if it was like at the beginning of your end step or something like that, but I think it's still okay. Kemba also doesn't have any evasion built onto her. A 2/4 for 3 mana isn't like an impressive stat line necessarily. She doesn't have any kind of evasion. You know, all of the things that you want your Voltron commander to have, you're going to have to put on her through the equipments, which your deck's going to have a lot of, but still, you know, you have to drop Kemba and then put in the extra work. She doesn't do much work by herself. So I have a lot of respect for Kemba, especially as being like kind of a classic, but I don't think it's really that good. I was thinking about putting it in the same tier as Grimold, you know, like bottom of A, top of B, something like that. But I actually, the more I think about it, I think it is just like BB. Like, you know, perfectly fine, but it doesn't have a lot of the things that I think a good Voltron commander needs. But, you know, there obviously would be a build of this that would still hold up well in today's day and age of commander. But I think compared to a lot of the other Voltron options that you have, I think it's perfectly fine, perfectly medium. Okay, next up we have Rogak, 0 mana, red, legendary, Kobold Warrior. That's a 0/1 with First Strike, Menace, and Trample, but it has Partner, and this is where it gets interesting. Now, there's a lot of partner options with Rogak that I think are pretty good. The one that was specifically high on EDH and I think someone left a comment wanting me to talk about this, is Yoshimaru, Ever Faithful, which is a 1 mana white dog 1/1. Whenever another legendary permanent enters the battlefield under your control, put a 1/1 counter on it. Now this is I think this is a CEDH build. I think I've seen some people take it that way, but even if you're just playing it like fairly as a Voltron strategy, I think it's still pretty good because you can drop both of your commanders on turn 1 theoretically, and both of them are, I think, going to be pretty good beaters just because Yoshimaru is theoretically going to get really big, and Ragavan, yeah, he only starts as a 0/1, but he's 0 mana, and he has a lot of abilities that you would want on a Voltron commander already. First Strike, Menace, Trample. That's pretty good evasion. So I actually, I think this is actually pretty good. I also like that Ragavan has partner because that means you can take him in multiple directions. You don't have to necessarily play it with Yoshimaru. You could build it in other ways. I'm actually going to put that in A. I like the flexibility, and I think he checks a lot of the marks for being a good Voltron commander. Okay, next up we have another oldie. This is Sigarda, host of Herons, for 2 green, white. It's a 5/5 angel with flying and hexproof, and spells and abilities your opponents control can't cause you to sacrifice permanents. So Sigarda is pretty good at protecting herself, and that is important in Voltron. This means she's safe from, a lot of the popular removal in the format, English Unmaking, Generous Gift, Path to Exile, Swords of Plowshare. Those kind of cards just can't hit Sigarda. That other piece of protection, that you can't sacrifice it. I don't know if that's as good. We don't see as many edict effects in Commander, especially in more recent years. But I do think that it's still somewhat relevant. Now, Sigarda still dies to board wipes and stuff like that, which is true for a lot of Voltron commanders, so it's not that big of a notch against her, but it is something to keep in mind just because all commander decks have at least a few board wipes in them for the most part, which kind of leads me into the fact that she's 5 mana. Not unreasonable, but I think a lot of the better Voltron commanders, on average, are the ones that you can get down early and then spend your later turns doing your setup, and that way, along the way, you're still gaining some chips of damage. Now, there is the argument that you could be doing it the other way around, right? You could be playing your equipments and stuff early, or any Anthem effects, play those early, keep the board clear, and then on the later turn, drop your commander, then start gaining the damage later. But I think overall, it's probably better to do it the other way around. You could argue either way, I think. So 5 mana, 5/5 with flying, it's okay. I think Sigarda's really held up purely for the ability to protect herself. I think this is another perfectly mid one. I think this is B, like somewhere in here, like middle of B. Pretty good at protecting herself, but I think it would be better if she was like less mana, maybe a smaller creature to rebalance it. Obviously, the protecting herself is great, but I would rather, have some kind of other way to buff her up a bit. I'm sure back in the day she was a lot better than she is now. Okay, now we have Sram, Senior Edificer, for 1 and a white, 2/2 Dwarf Advisor. Whenever you cast an aura, equipment, or vehicle spell, draw a card. Sram I see as a value piece in a lot of decks, but I think as a commander he is still pretty dang good. Being in white, you don't want to say like no auras, I know auras are more blown to blowout than equipments are, but there are a lot of good auras in white, so having the option is better than not having the option. And at least in Sram as the Helm, he's, at least going to, the card's at least going to replace itself. If you play an aura onto Sram and Sram gets removed, yeah, that obviously sucks. You would have to play around, like have Sun Titan in your deck or some other way to bring it back if you really need it again. But at least Sram's going to draw you a card when you cast it. And because Sram is only 2 mana, you're going to be able to get him down pretty easy. He is only a 2/2 with no evasion built into him, which, isn't great. But, getting him down on turn 1, turn 2, and then being able to start chipping away with commander damage is pretty good. And then obviously those auras and equipments are going to be drawing you cards, finding you better options, and you're going to be able to build up his evasion that way. And like I kind of said earlier, I do think that the lower mana commanders that you can get out early and then soup them up is better than doing it the other way around. Overall, I just think Sram is a pretty neat commander. I think he's a cool card in general. I've run him in the 99 of some decks before. I think he's somewhere in the top of A, bottom of S, if I'm being honest. We'll put him in bottom of S for now. We'll reassess later. But I think he's a great way to keep the ball rolling and get in damage early. Okay, we have both of the Thruns in this list. I think we're actually going to start with original Thrun first, so we can see power creep at its finest. But original Thrun is the last troll for 2 green. He's a troll shaman, 4/4 that can't be countered, and he can't be the target of spells or abilities your opponents control, so errata to hexproof, and then you can pay 1 and a green to regenerate him. Thrun actually is a pretty good card, especially if you're running up against a blue deck, because, one of the mean things you could do is, this is true for any archetype, but because Voltron decks are so emphasized on getting the commander out, countering your commander, it doesn't feel very good. And then the hexproof is obviously great. That makes it even harder. If it does get cast, it does get to land on the battlefield. It does become a little bit harder for your opponents to deal with, even though it does to board wipes. But I think maybe not all of the ones on this list that we're talking about today, but most, if not all of them, are going to die to board wipes. So, that just happens. It is what it is. But even then, it still has regenerate, so it's even harder to get rid of. There are exile-based board wipes nowadays, stuff like Farewell and whatnot. So it's not like Thrun is unanswerable. I think his power really just comes from being able to stick around. He doesn't have any evasion built into him. He doesn't have trample or menace or anything like that you would want on maybe a lot of your other Voltron commanders. But the power of being able to just kind of play him, and then it's really hard for your opponents to remove him, I think makes him actually still have some staying power in today's world. I'm gonna put him in bottom of A. I think maybe top of B is probably more realistic. I know he is probably power crept out by a lot of other Voltron strategies. I still like him though. I think there is some power in being able to keep him around and not have to get commander taxed out of it. Because that's the other thing. If your Voltron commander is removed a few times, it's harder and harder to bring him back because you have to worry about commander tax. I also do kind of just like green Voltron builds. I think that's kind of fun. Okay, the other Thrun is the newer one. This is from Phyrexia All Will Be One. This is Thrun, Breaker of Silence. This is 3 green, so 5 mana, 5/5, Troll Shaman again. Can't be countered, has trample. That's a nice upside. And he can't be the target of non-green spells your opponents control or abilities from non-green sources your opponents control. And as long as it's your turn, it is indestructible. This is this is power creep at its finest. So still can't be countered. It's 1 more mana, sure, but it's mono green. So you're going to be able to play land ramp as well as any, maybe you have some kind of artifact synergies in your deck because you're Voltron, you're going to want some equipment. So maybe you have more mana, like artifact-based mana rocks than you would normally have. So I think the extra mana is not a big deal. And it is a bigger body. It has trample. It's going to be easier to get in that damage. And then not being able to be targeted by non-green spells and abilities is probably objectively worse than hexproof, but that's still really good protection. I know green is like very heavily played, especially on the more casual side of things. But even then, what are they going to do? Cast Prey Upon or something to fight it or whatever? I mean, there's just fairly limited green removal. I mean, Beast Within is a very heavily played card, but outside of that, there's only so much your opponents can do, and it being indestructible on your turn is obviously great. Indestructible is a great way to try to ensure that your commander is quite likely to get to stick around, which is another thing that I liked about original Thrun. So this is making me reassess myself because I don't think this is something I would build. I don't think this is like necessarily an S tier commander. So we're going to put him in top of A, but it is making me think maybe other Thrun needs to go down to top of B, but we'll reassess later. All right, next up we have another oldie but goodie. This is Uril the Miststalker for 2 red, green, white, 5/5 beast, and it has hexproof, and it gets +2/+2 for each aura attached to it. So again, we don't love auras because they are so prone to blowout, but the fact that Uril does have hexproof makes it slightly less likely to die to blowout, make it feel like you lost a lot of those auras. You are also in the colors that if you did lose all of your auras, it's not that hard to get them back. White and green especially have a lot of ways to get permanents opponents back into play, or back in your hand at least. Uril should be able to get pretty big pretty fast. I know I was kind of, poo-pooing on 5-mana commanders, but I don't think it's that bad in this instance. I think overall Uril is, like, the main comparison I would make is probably Sigarda, right? It's also 5 mana. It's also, you kind of have to wait till your commander's in play before you can start doing stuff. But I do think Uril is better than Sigarda. But I think Uril is also another example of one that's just kind of been power crept out of the Voltron, at least in if you're going to try playing more competitively. I think if you're wanting to play for nostalgia, perfectly fine. It's definitely powerful. The fact that he's going to get +2/+2 for each aura also means that you can dedicate your aura slots to things that are giving him evasion, flying, trample, indestructible, stuff like that. And you don't have to worry about the ones that are power oriented. So he is actually going to get pretty huge pretty fast. I think this is the definition for a top of A commander, though. I think he has been power crept out by other options, but there's no reason like you couldn't build a good version of him. All right, next up we have a pretty new one. This is Wilson Refined Grizzly. For 1 and a green, it's a 2/2 that can't be countered. Vigilance, Reach, Trample, Ward 2, Bear Warrior, choose a background. I think in a lot of ways, this is just kind of like Thrun as far as like green, hard to get rid of, except Wilson in some ways is kind of better because it has a lot of these keywords that you want on your Voltron commanders anyways. Specifically though, the main background that people recommended and was highly ranked on EDHREC is Raised by Giants, which is for 5 and a green. It's a legendary enchantment background. This says commander creatures you own have base power and toughness 10/10 and are giants in addition to their other types. So if you have that as comparison, if Raised by Giants is the background for Wilson, he's now a 10/10 that can't be countered with Vigilance, Reach, Trample, and Ward 2. That all of a sudden becomes a lot better. I like Wilson in the same way that I like Rograk because it has background. It's kind of like Partner. It's a little nerfed, but I like that there's the flexibility as far as there being multiple ways for you to build it. I like that from a creative perspective. But if you are just going to do that, I think that is really good. I think that's going to have to be A tier. I don't think I like it as much as Rograk. It's really good. It's hard to answer. It's going to get big. You're going to be able to get in damage early in the game. And then later in the game, when you can get the background down, you're going to be wrecking stuff. All right, next up is one of my personal new favorites. So I don't think this card even existed yet when I made the list. Maybe it did. I don't remember. But this is Jarad and Multani. 3 black, green, 18/6 Frog Spirit Elemental, and that's it. I mentioned before, I really like Jarad. I think it's funny, and I think pairing him with Multani to get the green in there obviously allows for some really fun shenanigans. I actually am building a Jarad and Multani deck right now. I don't know if I'll have an opportunity to come show you guys it on our Commander gameplay series or not, but I hope I can because it is turning out to be pretty fun. But what you do, I think, objectively to make Jarad good is you're playing a lot of the cards that care about power. You're playing cards as like, Return of the Wild Speaker or whatnot, draw cards equal to the highest power among creatures you control. You're playing cards like that just for value or greater good, stuff like that. To sacrifice it, draw that many cards equal to the power, stuff like that. And just playing Jarad and Multani for power. And then as protection, you're playing a lot of the black has a ton of cards that are like, if a creature dies this turn, return it to the battlefield, stuff like that. But because Jarad and Multani is huge, if you do line it up to where like one of your opponents doesn't have any blockers, or you can play something that makes it unblockable. Particularly in my version of the deck, I just have Rogue's Passage as a land in the deck to make him unblockable. You can knock him out with only, it's 21 commander damage to kill him, but and it's 18 power. So if you just buff him even a tiny bit, you can just one hit KO someone. Yeah, worst case scenario, you can just hit him twice. But also you could just give him Infect, and then it's really problematic. So yeah, that's a little bit about my Jarad and Multani deck. Is it's mostly just playing off of him for value. But if you did want to take him in the Voltron direction, it doesn't take much. Yeah, being only 6 toughness means that it's there is a world where your opponents can just chump block it and kill it, but if you give them trample or make them unblockable, it doesn't take much of a buff to get in and kill someone with commander damage Or like I said, Infect. I know a lot of people don't really like Infect, but this is an S tier commander for me, just because I think whether you're doing it as a Voltron build or just a value engine, it's also just peak game design. It's a 6 mana 18/6 with no other abilities. I think that's hilarious. I think it's awesome. And I know some people might disagree with my assessment there, but I don't care. I love it. Last one we're going to talk about today is Zurgo Helmsmasher for 2 red, white, black, 7/2 Orc Warrior with haste. Has to attack each combat if able, has indestructible as long as it's your turn, and whenever a creature dealt damage by him is killed, put a +1/+1 counter on him. There is also a secret lair version of him that is Warhammer, and that looks pretty awesome. I don't love it. It does have low toughness, but it does, have indestructible as long as it's your turn, which is nice because it has to attack every turn if able. And I know that attacking is what you need to do in Voltron if you're going to win the game, but there are situations where you might just need the blocker, and having a giant, if you're playing Voltron, if your Voltron commander's out in play and it's huge or whatever, it is an effective blocker. If that's really what the game comes down to, now that's a situation where you're probably not going to win the game anyways, but having the option's nice. So at least he's indestructible as long as it's your turn. Your opponents aren't going to be able to kill it in combat unless they have some kind of -1/-1 shenanigans or exile, right? It doesn't have any kind of protection as far as hexproof or shroud or something like that. I think if you are able to slap some trample or something onto this to where you're always going to be able to get in for at least a little bit of damage is always going to be good, because then your opponents are going to have to question whether it's even worth chump blocking or not, because as their creatures die, this is just going to continue to get bigger. 5 mana is not great as far as we've considered as far as Voltron commanders go, but it's not terrible, especially because it's going to be able to attack right away with haste, and it does have 7 power. People are really going to have to contemplate whether or not they care to block that. I think it's going to make the game pretty interesting. I like things that kind of get wonky. So, as far as from an objective gameplay perspective, maybe having to attack every combat if able, maybe not the best, but it at least makes the game pretty interesting, keeps things moving. Hopefully prevents a lot of the long commander games that are becoming more and more common, in my opinion. There's also some +1/+1 synergies, as we've kind of talked about in these colors as well. So power level, I think Zurgo is probably the perfect definition of B tier, as well as a lot of these other oldie commanders. But as far as the cool factor, and I think he's probably more fun to play than some of these other older commanders, I'm going to put him in bottom of A. I'm actually going to go ahead and put him in front of old Thrun as well. But I think Thrun, I think he's fought hard. I think he's beat out the top of B. I think he gets to stay in bottom of A. But this is going to do it for me, guys. This is going to be my personal picks for these 13 commanders that we looked at today. I don't think I'm going to do another Voltron tier list anytime soon, since I did one last year that covered 20 something commanders, and we looked at another 13 today. So unless we have some kind of really weird set where a ton of new Voltron commanders come into play, I think that's going to do it for me as far as Voltron tier list. But if you'd like to see any other tier lists, get my personal opinions on some different commanders, let me know in the comments. I know you're going to do it anyway, so if there's one that I left out, you can leave a comment about that as well. But if you'd like other Magic the Gathering related content, make sure you're subscribed, like this video, give it a share, all that YouTube algorithm nonsense, and hopefully we'll see you again later. Bye.